Oh, okay. Thank you, Marlon. Well, I'm Bonnie Claremont, and I'm citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation. I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've been with TLPI for over 20 years. And prior to coming to TLPI, I was an advocate for many, many years, working at a rape crisis center, working at local domestic violence programs, including domestic violence shelter for a number of years. So that's my background, and I'm so happy that you have joined us for this webinar. And I'm always excited to share information about advocacy. It's, I think, some of the most rewarding work that anyone can do, although it can be often challenging for many reasons, and I'll share some of that with you today. So thank you for joining us. And um, I really, really encourage your input, your feedback. So there will be an opportunity for evaluation because I love to hear from you all. And also, it helps us to look at what are the kinds of needs that people may have for future webinars or for resources. So, encourage your input. Next slide. This is our usual disclaimer that we have for each of our webinars and so forth, our publications. I won't read it to you, but it's there. This is our agenda for today. um, we'll be talking about the model of victim advocacy, provide you just a very brief history and how it differs from other models of service provision, such as its victim-centered versus case-centered services. I'll share with you the types of advocates and how this relates to issues of confidentiality and policies. And I'll explore the roles of advocates. There are many, and the types of advocates and victim services provided by community-based advocates, which is the kind of advocacy that I've done personally. So speaking from that experience, we'll also explore how victim advocacy programs and their services benefit victims. And I'll share some of the challenges, like I said, in barriers of victim services in tribal communities, and then discuss how collaboration with other disciplines like legal services can benefit victims by improving and focusing on safety needs of victims and their children, community safety, and also as it relates to offender accountability. So that's our agenda for today. Pretty ambitious agenda. Next slide. These are the learning objectives, and they're pretty much match the agenda. So I won't read these to you. And the purpose of our technical assistance with this Office on Violence Against Women grant is to facilitate collaboration between victim services in tribal communities and legal services that may be on or off tribal lands or tribal communities, because oftentimes it's been my experience as an advocate that there's not a strong connection there. There's not a strong collaborative efforts that have been established in a lot of places. And as you all may know, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, it can often you know, benefit from legal services, which oftentimes does not exist, or the tribe doesn't, may not have that kind of resource. So that's the purpose of our initiative. And I'll be referring to this initiative as TLAPS, which is Tribal Legal Assistance Program Services. Trying to remember what the acronym stands for, but I'll be mentioning TLAPS, and you'll hear more about it as we go along. Next slide. So for this history, I've been a part of this history. So like I tell my kids, I'm old as dirt, and had had the opportunity, the honor, the privilege to be a part of this history and kind of like a grandmother to the advocacy movement, the advocacy work model. I hate to call it a model, because I oftentimes see models kind of come and go and they evolve so much. And a lot of my work is really retaining the integrity of advocacy because it was birthed for a lot of reasons, right? It was at the advocacy model was birthed because other models weren't working well for victims of domestic violence. For example, you know, um, human services or child welfare, child protection often were removing children from victims of domestic violence all too frequently. Rather than holding offenders accountable, they were holding victims accountable for what was happening to their children. So I'll be discussing some of that, but and oftentimes victims had no place to go and no shelter, no place safe to take themselves and their children. So that was one of the reasons why the advocacy model was birthed back then. Um, but previous even tribal nations were mostly matrilineal in social structures, and women were considered sacred and powerful, right? And because we are gifted with the ability to bring forth future generations, right? So there was a lot of protection towards women and children because they're the future of the tribal nations. And so it was often looked at as having roles. We had roles, and men were the protectors and the providers and looked after their villages to ensure they were safe. And if someone committed some violent acts and egregious acts of violence, they had their own justice systems to address that. And it was dressed addressed pretty quickly, right? So that kind of behavior wasn't tolerated, and it was stopped as soon as it happened. So this movement started. The work of advocacy started, I would say, in the late '60s, perhaps the early '70s, which was kind of an era of self-determination and social activism within our tribal nations. So it really sparked an upsurge of women organizing, speaking out about violence happening in their communities and in their homes. And I remembered that happening in our communities where, women gathered around kitchen tables and gathered around their front, porches and said, my daughter was abused or beaten by my son-in-law, and she had to come home, and now I don't know what to do. I'm kind of scared. And that kind of visiting with one another sparked the need and the interest in creating some kind of response, some responses to ensure safety of victims that were experiencing this kind of violence, which that gave birth to the advocacy model, which was based in social and systems change work, because oftentimes, victims were blamed for the violence that was happening, and then they were also the victims were ashamed and kind of embarrassed at the same time. So there was a need for somewhere where, victims could go and take their children or their families. Same with sexual assault. We still struggle a lot with that on sheltering victims of sexual assault, because a lot of shelters say, they only accept victims that are abused within an intimate relationship, right? So it makes it a little difficult if a victim is raped by a stranger and maybe a gang member who's threatening her that if she goes to law enforcement, he'll come and kill her. Well, that victim would need shelter, and yet if that shelter has in their policies they don't accept rape victims or sex trafficking victims, makes it really difficult for those victims to find safety. Um, so and and I'll share again with you later on the power and control wheel, but the motive we know is for power on the part of abusers, for power and control. So as advocates, we knew that part of our job was to be good relatives and to re-empower victims and the people that we work with, and see them as human beings, see them as our relatives that need help, that need safety, that need shelter, that need food and clothing. So that's where advocacy and shelters came about. And also along with that, we did a lot of legislative work to really leverage resources that, maybe that the state had to help our communities. So there was a lot of that kind of work going on within each state and also on a federal level. And from that came in 1994 the first Violence Against Women Act. And there were very few Native women. There was a handful of us, sort of here in their pockets, were who got wind of this, the VAWA Act. So, again, we said we need our own programs that are culturally specific. We need for the federal government to understand that we're sovereign nations and we have our own laws, we have our own ways of helping one another, and we need resources to support what we're doing in tribal communities. So there was an upsurge of a lot of Native women and sisters and even brothers who went forward and really work to leverage federal dollars for tribal communities, which we see the benefits of today. And part of that is the creation of tribal coalitions. I don't know how many states now have tribal coalitions to address domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, now even sex trafficking, and murdered missing Indigenous relatives. I believe it's in the teens. Maybe it might be more than that now, as far as tribal coalitions. So again, that was all made possible with some Violence Against Women Act funding. Next slide. So back in again the 90s, we locally got together and said we need to have people understand our work a little better. And at that time, we said, well, first we need for people to understand what is an advocate. So we spent a retreat, a weekend where we wanted to come up with a little description or I don't want to say definition but from our perspective, from our lens, what is an advocate? So this is the one we came up with, and I still use it today, just because it still is relevant today. And it's to act as the biased supporter of women. And at that time, it was the majority of the victims were women, and it's still that way based on the data, which doesn't mean that men and boys aren't victims of one type of violence or another. Of course, they are. But from this, the advocacy model was really born out of the need to provide shelter to women relatives who were being battered and needed safety with their children. Um, and of course, men also, there were men who were fathers that needed help as well. So I'm not excluding that. But this definition is focused on being the biased supporter of women. And I found that to be true and understood clearly that, like, for even as, courts do jury selection, if I when they start talking about what kind of work do you do, and if I as soon as I say I work as an advocate, I'm gone. I'm excused and dismissed from being a juror. So I've never actually served on a jury panel because of that, because I'm very biased for victims, right? Um, and even in our training with advocacy, that's one of the first things we do is believe victims. And we're not there. One of the hats that we wear is not a judge. We're not a judge. We're not judges, right? We're advocates. And our role is to believe this person, what they tell us. And we let other people be the judge of that for one reason, whatever it is. But our role is to believe this person, because I found that, and there's some data that also backs that up, that people don't lie about being victimized because of issues like shame. Oftentimes victims are so embarrassed that they're not going to tell someone. And if they have the courage enough to disclose, then it's our job, someone as, the person being disclosed to has to believe that person. Otherwise, what can happen? They're going to shut down probably and not tell anyone else, right? And carry that shame for years. So it's so important. That's one of the main things I tell advocates they can do is listen and believe this person. And also advocating for the expressed interests and safety of women and their children. Expressed, not assume that she needs this, she needs that, or do any kind of planning without her input, without the victim's input, because that's part of re-empowering her decision making, right? um, Including safe space and other resources to regain control over their lives, to provide leadership and expertise based on women's experiences within justice, law enforcement, social service, and medical systems, to prioritize women's safety and offender accountability in all aspects of the work, including maintaining confidentiality. And now this definition or description was created in 1996. Next slide. In in future webinars, we'll be talking a lot about the importance of confidentiality, the laws as it relates to victim rights, and I can't say it enough that the importance of confidentiality is so incredibly important to safety, the safety of victims. And it's always number one, top of the list importance when working with victims that they understand clearly their rights when they share information with advocates in this instance, but with anyone that, what information they share, they have a right to know what's going to happen with that information, where it gets documented, where those papers are being kept, or where the e-files are being kept, who has access to that. um, you know, Caution about how you communicate with victims, particularly in public places, right? And that's linked to privacy. I've always told victims that if I see them at a social gathering, at a powwow or a ceremony, I'm not going to acknowledge them because most people in my community know that I'm an advocate. And I know that assumptions can be made pretty quickly. So I tell the people, the women that I'm working with, that I'm not going to be the first to acknowledge them, and please understand me that I'm not trying to be, sort of stuck up or whatever. But that's my respect for their need for privacy and confidentiality. And if they choose to approach me, then of course, yes, I will, have a little chat with them or visit whatever is appropriate at the time. So I just wanted to add that because that's one of the reasons why victims don't come forward, is because they don't want people to know what's happened to them. And now, especially with social media, right, it's a lot easier for that kind of information to get out. So it's just, so I can't express enough the importance of that, because anything they share with us can get back to their abuser. And if they're being threatened, if their lives are being threatened, that if you share any of this, if you squeal to law enforcement, or if you tell anyone, even your mother. So oftentimes abusers won't even let the victim see their family, right? Cuts them off from their family because of this. So again, it's so incredibly important, the whole issue of confidentiality and how it's linked to safety. So the role of advocacy from a tribal perspective, ending violence against women and all other forms of violence, lies in our ability to reclaim our roles and responsibilities as relatives. Advocates ideally role model this sacred connection. So it's about helping one another. It's about taking care of one another and one another's children. As growing up as a child, any of my relatives that experienced this would come to our house in the middle of the night often. I'd wake up and we would have a family, sleeping on the floor in the next room. And my mom would be, chasing away abusers at the doorway. We used to have a wood pile right outside our door because my grandma cooked on the wood stove. And and the abuser would take one of those big pieces of wood and knock on the door. I used to think he was going to knock the door in, and my mom would say, "You get away from here. There's no one here, and I'm going to call the cops if you don't leave." So that was my mom. So it was like that was my first experience of a domestic violence shelter, is taking in our relatives. But it really is about taking care of one another, and that's another reason why the advocacy model was birthed, is to help one another and be there for one another. Next slide. So I say this in our trainings, and this is it. We have to make this relevant to who we are, right, as Native people. That advocacy is about being a good relative, plain and simple. And this is I could put my name in there, but I know a lot of advocates come from the same perspective. It's really about being a good relative. So even in terms of how we address people, right, it's really okay to incorporate that in the work we do, because, in my tribe, we address people by how we're related, because that goes back to the beginning, right? That's how we were taught. That's how our ancestors taught us. And that's really okay, rather than putting a label on them of client or uh, and even victim. I have issues with, but out of convenience, that's what I use in everyday basis and training and so forth. But on a face-to-face, if I'm related and I know that I'm related to this person, I'll still continue to acknowledge them as such, because it really does speak to our history and the importance of retaining our cultural traditions, right? Um, and it's difficult because we say that we're all related. All of you on this webinar, you're my relatives. And, out right away, in a legal perspective, maybe people are going to say, well, you can't work with this person because that's whatever they call that, nepotism or conflict of interest or all those things. It's like, that's going to be hard then, because like I consider myself related to everyone in my community in one way or another. So just wanted to add that as well. But I encourage people, and locally here, and I don't know if it's being done all over, but I hear programs, like my son works at a shelter, um, a houseless shelter for the houseless, and they refer to their clients, quote, as relatives. So when they make announcements over their mic to all the shelter residents, they acknowledge them as relatives. So I just wanted to add that. Again, I'm talking about the grassroots model of advocacy, which I encourage this kind of language and communication. Next slide. So when you think about how we are as relatives, I think it provides us that opportunity then to look at the many hats that we wear as relatives, right? So I just wanted to put that out there to keep that in mind. The kind of hats that you wear as a relative, of being a good relative, what does that require you to do, right? And it's not always just limited to a job description. So I also wanted to put that out there. The two main types of advocates that I'm referring to are community-based or grassroots advocates. And these are individuals who work for tribal or a nonprofit or an independent organization of some type, right? A standalone organization. We also have the system-based. And these are the advocates who work for criminal justice agencies, such as a victim witness advocate who is based at the federal prosecutor's office, the AUSA office, or law enforcement. They may be, an advocate based there, or they may be hospital based. There's many of those even on a local level here. Um, and the differences are confidentiality and training factors, right? And, the community based grassroots advocates, we train them to adhere to strict confidentiality policies, that we don't share anything outside of our organization, and even almost even in terms with one another. And if we do, we put that say, this is who we're going to share information with. And if that changes, then we have to change the release so that victim is aware that, that maybe that our who we're communicating with is expanding. Maybe we're going to share some information with them at the upcoming SART meeting, Sexual Assault Response Team meeting. Um, so we want to make sure always that we're in communication with this person we're working with so they have full knowledge, full disclosure of who we're sharing information with and how, and for what reason, and how that information, how long can we do that? Is there a time factor? Is it while we're working with them? Is there a date that we can provide them that will stop sharing information with them? So the more information, the better contained in the release of information. Systems-based are advocates who work, such as in the prosecutor's office, that's going to share information with the prosecutors that the victim shares with them. And that's part of building a case, right, for prosecutors. They want all the information they can get to build a strong case to prosecute the offender, right? So their purposes for that information is different from us as the grassroots advocates. And I'll share more about what we do specifically as advocates. Um, and along with the grassroots advocacy model, there's a 40-hour training requirement where advocates are trained about these things, about confidentiality, about the services that they will be delivering. And they receive that over a 40-hour period of time. And at the end of that, they also have to continue receiving training from a program like a victim advocacy program. They have to be continued to be trained, so basically to receive continuing education, right, in the work of advocacy, and also that they're supervised in their advocacy work. So those are the two. Most states have this 40-hour requirement. The states that have this, that provide the advocacy, the 40-hour advocacy training, may not be culturally appropriate. So a lot of our TA programs in tribal communities have been providing this type of training, such as locally here, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. They provide a 40-hour training for advocates. And the virtual training is like maybe 30 hours, and then the 10 hours are for advocates to go back and receive training from their local law enforcement about their protocols, how they respond to sexual assault cases, training from their local prosecutors' offices. If they're in a PL 280 state, they would want to get training from their state local prosecutors, and then also from their local medical facilities that do the forensic exams. So that additional 10 hours that they may not have uh, gotten training virtually, they go back to their communities and get that additional training, put that together, then they have their 40 hours that they can, that's documented. And so they will hold that victim advocate privilege status. And I'll talk more about that. But that's the 40-hour training rule, I guess you would call it, to give advocates that status, just like lawyers have their lawyer-client privilege or doctors have their doctor-patient privilege. If advocates get that 40-hour training, then they hold that privilege as well with victims.
Hey, Bonnie,
Uh-huh.
we had a question when you were talking about addressing people as, the people you work with as relatives. And we had a question asking, what would you recommend to a non-native how to address a survivor?
I'm of the mind that it's really up to the victim and what they're comfortable with. In a tribal community, I've never had any problems with native to native as acknowledging each other as relatives. And that can change, but I think everything has to come from, we encourage and explain why we call the people we work with relatives. And we don't oftentimes we don't even need to explain because they already know that. Non-natives, some non-natives may not be aware of why we do that. But if there are some victims that don't want to have that relationship with their advocate who's non-native, then that choice should be respected as well.
Thank you.
Yes, if you have any questions, post them in your chat. I have wonderful assistants.
To
Next
that,
slide.
Bonnie,
Pardon
Bonnie,
me?
we have a question from the Q&A box about the 40-hour training. And the
Uh,
question is, do you know where we can find training for the 40-hour training?
the if it's sexual assault specific, the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition is one, and they do that a couple of times a year. That's MUSAC.org, MIWSAC.org. Also, Red Wind provides um, 40-hour training. I don't remember their website, red-wind or something.org, but they also provide a lot of really good resources on a variety of topics, and they do provide the 40-hour. There's also one that's non-native, which I think it's Nova, our grant manager said, but again, that's non-native. Okay. All right. Um, Advocacy is different than mental health or social services, right? Um, and I hate to go too into detail, but I used this table for many years because I'm so concerned about that we not lose sight of the reasons why the grassroots community-based advocacy model was birthed, why it came about to begin with. And for me, during that time, it was because a lot of the other services weren't meeting the needs of victims of domestic violence, sexual assault. And before advocacy was birthed, the model of advocacy was birthed, I was working in Indian education programs as a counselor and recruiter for a college and tribal liaison for another college or university. And um, almost in every instance, in every job I've worked in prior to coming into advocacy, I worked with victims of domestic violence. It was one of the problems that was interfering with Native people getting their education. It was a reason oftentimes, the students that I worked with were turning to alcohol because they didn't know how to deal with the trauma of what was happening to them or their children. So there was this need because not only were they being victimized, but they were having their children removed, taken from them. So it's so incredibly important to look at, advocacy as a viable model and also to keep it, uh, you know, the services being offered to have them be culturally appropriate for our relatives that we're working with. So in mental health, often there's a diagnosis or some kind of a plan or some kind of a problem why this person came to this program and have some kind of a label attached to it, right? A family dysfunction or, something based out of the DSM, whatever it is now, DSM 5 or whatever. In advocacy, there is no diagnosis. This person has experienced some type of a trauma and they need support and they need safety, they need advocacy, they need support, and so forth. Um, they Based on the diagnosis in in these other models, there's a treatment or a case plan, right? In advocacy, there is not a treatment plan. We sit down and visit with the person that comes in. We sit down and visit with our relative. Oftentimes, we use words like interviewing or other words like that. But really, if we bring it back down to that setting of around our kitchen table or around the front porch or around, our homes. Again, we can create that similar setting within our advocacy programs where, if someone comes in and say, I got beat up by my boyfriend or my husband and I need help, to try not to take those intake forms out right away, but just sit down and visit with this person about what they're going through and ask what they want, what they need, rather than coming about with a treatment plan or a case plan, right? So on this other model, it's case centered. I hear that often, even coming from advocates. They say, well, I got a case meeting over here, a case, I can't remember what they call them, case review or something. And I'm like, oh, no, don't say case. um, but in the advocacy model, it's more victim centered, right? So we're not excluding or eliminating the humanity within it. That this isn't just a case we're working on. It's not just something we write down on a form and we put it in a file folder and stick it in the file cabinet or in an e-file. This is a human being that has concerns, that has needs, that has worries, that has challenges, that may be afraid for their lives, right, and the lives of their children. Um, and they're experiencing something that's not necessarily internally imposed. It's not an internally imposed trauma. It's something that has been externally imposed upon them. They were beaten, right, by someone, and they're now experiencing this trauma. And the reason why this person chose violence as a way to exert power and control, that thought, that thinking, that kind of social conditioning comes from someplace, right? Whether it's from media, whether it's from peers, whether it's from witnessing that kind of violence in the home, wherever that comes from, we have a society that gives that person some kind of permission to harm someone in order to feel powerful, right? That's called externally imposed trauma. And that's what this victim is a victim of, right? Based on that decision, that choice that abuser has made. And then that's what that abuser needs to be held accountable for making that choice, right? Um, and on this other model, on the mental health social services, workers and even the victim are expected to maintain the status quo and the rules about that system, right? And the system's requirements. Can't change them. No, we gotta stick by the rules and by the rule book to the letter, or something will happen. I'm not sure what. Um, in the advocacy model, it's really about how can we make the system work better for the victim and our relative. What's needed to change? How can we create that change? Simple things like in our advocacy program, have protection order forms right within our program so we don't have to take this person down to the courthouse to get this form filled out, right? um, Things like that. Or when they come in, offer them coffee, offer them something to drink, sit down and visit with them, find out if they're in need of some kind of medical attention versus wanting to get that intake form done and have them have to sign all these forms before we're able to provide them services, right? So on these other models, they're much more bureaucratic and hierarchy versus, the advocacy model. It was birthed by, oftentimes by women who actually experienced the violence themselves. Like myself, I had relatives that, my mom sheltered. That was my first experience. I was only 4, 5, 6 years old when she was doing that. But I remember clearly her opening our home to people who are experiencing violence. So it's, again, so important not to forget the humanity of what's happening to this person and to be more focused on the needs of the system versus the needs of this person that's sitting before us because they took the courage to disclose and seek help and reach out for help. I don't know if you have questions about these factors. I'll talk later at some point about the different teams that have been established, like coordinated community response teams and sexual assault response teams in tribal communities. And the purpose of that is to bring people together from all of these different agencies. Some of them are system based, right? And also, it's oftentimes the advocates themselves who are organizing these teams as a way to bridge a lot of the gaps that exist, right? So that we don't lose our relatives by them falling through the cracks and not getting their needs met, not getting their need for safety or shelter or their rights met, right, for safety. So I'll be talking about that at some point. Okay, next slide. The many roles of advocates, the many hats worn by advocates. So I want to ask, what roles have you seen advocates play when serving victims? And what kind of services do they provide in your community? Just enter that in your chat. I don't know if I want to unmute someone who, if you feel more comfortable, just sharing that. Uh, if we turn on your mic, you could visit about it.
We have a couple hands raised. We have Sherry Larson and Chelsea. And,
Sherry.
and for the respect of confidentiality, we can pause the recording and then resume. Does that work with our presenter?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So for everyone listening to the recording or the video after we post it, we'll be pausing the recording and resume. To add to the prompt, Bonnie, we have a couple of folks who responded. One participant said that advocates play many roles, one in particular that they may be an investigator or a researcher. Another participant had shared that as advocates, we provide victim advocacy, of course, complete confidentiality. We keep in contact with the Tundra Women's Coalition. Most of the cases that this person has had were close relatives. So the role of case manager was enabled to take over and identified handling casework. Another respondent said, I have seen fellow advocates be a confident taxi driver, psychologists, spiritual advisors with shoulders to crown, a babysitter. Another person responded, educator, safety planner, support advisors, liaison, system navigators, mediator, mentor. Those are the responses to the prompt.
Wow. Thank you, Marlon. I love those. I absolutely love those. Yes, those are the many roles, the many hats that advocates wear. And, I I totally appreciate all the work that advocates do in their communities and often with little support and not enough resources. Not enough resources. As far as Violence Against Women Act funding, I don't even know that half of the tribes that exist have VOWL funding. I think there was a study done that we did several years back with a grant we had. I think at that time it was maybe 30 or 40%, maybe. We have to ask our grant manager if she knows how many tribes actually have Violence Against Women Act funding. So they have to rely on other resources, right, to be able to be in a paid position. But I also know advocates who do a lot of volunteer work. And I really get frustrated with programs that locally that are non-native that only bring in native advocates as volunteers. It's like, okay, so for now that's fine. You can it gives them experience, but when you do have paid positions open, please consider them because they've shown their interest and their commitment. So I just have to put that little plug in because I worked in a program that I would not tolerate that. If we had non-natives volunteering, then they should be first to be considered for any paid positions under VAWA. Not discriminating, we would never do that, but they've shown their experience and their commitment and their skill levels. Okay, next slide. Thank you for your input. The one thing I want to just mention, in our training with advocates, I'm always really encourage advocates to be careful about not overstepping their roles and watching their boundaries as far as not letting this person they're working with think that they're a psychologist as far as even the things that they would document. Be careful not to overstep your professional boundaries to say, I'm working with someone who seems to be really depressed, right? Um, because we don't necessarily know that. What they're experiencing might be a direct connection to the trauma. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have the diagnoses of depression, right? Because oftentimes abusers may say, you don't listen to her, she's crazy. She's always saying, that she's depressed and she's crazy. That's why she doesn't take good care of our children. And that, if that's documented somewhere, that may be cause for removal of her children. And I get worried about that. So even that example, and also to be careful not to give legal advice. And I'll talk more about that. So even though it's tempting because you may know the law inside out, upside down, it's really important to stay within our boundaries because if not, victims will latch onto that. And because they trust advocates so much, they're going to turn to the advocate to say, what do you think I should do? And what you're giving might be legal advice. And you have to be careful that we keep those roles as clear as possible. Okay. Safety. Back, back, back to that last slide. Oops. Okay. So roles of advocates, and we've talked some about these already. Crisis like safety, that's always going to be first, always in any communication, any training we do with advocates. Safety, you could be saving someone's life. You could be saving someone's life. So I want legal services to know that as well, that that's the perspective we're coming from, is safety is so important. That victim safety, but also the safety of the children of that victim, the safety of the family, the extended family, the relatives, and then even more than that, the community. So that's where we talk about offender accountability being so incredibly important. I could hear someone talking. Someone needs to mute their mic. Okay. Um, Crisis intervention, and that could be done at any point, right? But primarily that's early on when someone has just experienced an act of violence, just got beaten or raped or other kind of violence. It could happen over a hotline if the advocacy program has one, or it could be in person, a walk-in, or a referral made where law enforcement call and say, we have someone here who needs an advocate, or at the hospital, right? So crisis intervention. And there's training specific to that role and that task. What does that look like? What are the immediate concerns of a victim? And that generally is to look at what are the needs for medical attention. If you hear from someone and they just now were assaulted, do they need medical attention? Was there a sexual assault that happened? Will they need a forensic exam? it would be good to encourage them to be seen as soon as possible so that evidence isn't lost, and also that they could be treated for injuries as well as getting emergency contraception to prevent pregnancy. And then also to provide them good information about their legal options, to file a criminal complaint or to seek civil legal services, by providing the referrals and accompanying them for whatever choices they make about their legal options. Um, and then because oftentimes that is when they choose the route of seeking legal help, that's often a really frustrating and um, just it's like walking through a maze with someone. So it's really important that as advocates that you all have the information you need. So you're giving the person you're working with good information about what to expect, and that in order that they can make informed decisions about their options, right? And then be able to walk with them through that maze or through the options that they select. And I'll be doing a webinar. I think it's the third one in this series, about walking with victims through a civil process and also a criminal process. Okay, next slide. So, assessing basic needs with the victim and providing necessary resources. And this is so important as advocates. In my mind, I'm like right away wanting to go to legal things. I'm doing that kind of just based on what she's telling me. This is probably really important. When she might be thinking more, what am I going to feed my kids this evening? Or my kids are getting off the bus at home and I'm not there to meet them, or I'm supposed to pick them up at school and I can't do that because I'm getting this forensic examination. And I've had that situation happen where the woman seemed really hesitant about going forward with this particular service. And I said, what's your concern? I'm really feeling like you're worried about something. And she said, yeah, my son gets off the bus and no one's going to be there to pick him up. And I was like, oh my gosh. So again, really important to look at basic needs, which can be, of course, emotional support. Uh, a lot of advocacy programs offer support groups, talking circles, for example, transportation. They may be worried about, well, it's great, all these services exist, but some of them are off tribal land or tribal community, tribal, um, the reservation, and I have to try. I don't have a vehicle, a dependable vehicle to take me there, and oftentimes we're kind of taught not to impose, right? So even legal services, if you're located off the reservation, it's good to have this collaborative relationship between victim services and legal services, but we have to make sure how to get this person to legal services if they live in on the res. They may need food, they may need clothing. If they've escaped with just the clothes on their backs, they may need clothing. Their kids may have witnessed the abuse, and how is that impacting them? It's good for advocates to say, how are your kids doing? Just a simple question. How are your kids doing? Um, and the impact on them, and who can help them with that, who can talk with them, because there are advocates, a lot of them are called child advocates, who know how to talk to kids who have experienced this, so that they can help them understand why this is happening, and it's not something they've done to cause the abuse, right? Also, resources for emergency housing, or maybe they want to remain in their home. What do they need then, such as having locks changed, right? Or having some kind of other supportive services so that they can return home. Strengthening life skills, identifying with victim long-term needs for housing. And this may come later on after the initial crises, but they may have need for long-term housing, affordable, decent housing, which is at a premium. Education, maybe they're thinking about going back to school, maybe employment. They need a job because the abuser, whoever committed this, is their support to the family. mental health healing services, providing access to those. Maybe they want to go to ceremony, whatever their spiritual beliefs are. Maybe they're wanting to know what do you know about the resources for that. So it's important to check out your spiritual leaders even to make sure they're safe people, because as we see in the news, not all of them are safe, just like pastors and priests and so forth. There are people who can misuse their power. Substance abuse treatment. Maybe they've been having some challenges with this, or maybe they have some history with this, that now with this new trauma they're triggered and may need to get back into some kind of a treatment program. Know the resources there and know who works there, and that they're understanding about victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so forth. And doing follow-up, continuing to follow up with them to see how they're doing, if this program that you've referred them to really are effective and are meeting their needs. And also advocacy programs are, like I said before, are instrumental in creating sexual assault response teams or coordinated community response teams. Okay, next slide. So just to give you an idea, this is some of the work of during the crisis intervention period, and it's not all inclusive. Just some things that I remembered when I did crisis intervention. Can happen all hours of the night, as someone mentioned. It's just what we do, right? And I had a good Mr. Mom who knew that I could be called at any time and never had an issue stepping in and getting the kids off to school when I was gone, either at the hospital or taking someone somewhere to help them get to safety. So it's not a 9 to 5 job, generally speaking, right? We address safety concerns. Same thing, right out the gate. We have to say, are you safe? Where are you? Where do you have children? Are they safe? What would it take to help you be safe? Do you need shelter? Do you need housing? Where's your perpetrator? Who is your perpetrator? Um, and those kind of questions all are directed towards ensuring this person is safe. Because again, like I said, it means you could be saving someone's life. Visit with the victim and others that may need support information about such things as basic needs. And again, safety information about options that are available, and to empathize. Right now is a time when this victim may be having a hard time focusing, and oftentimes that's kind of mistaken for, well, she had an attitude, or she wouldn't even look at me, or she wouldn't even listen, or she didn't hear a thing I was saying. Well, yeah, because she's just, thankful to be alive, and maybe thought for a minute there she may not survive, and what's going to happen to her children. It's so important for us to keep that in mind when working with someone, that this is a time when they may not be thinking clearly, and it's also a time where they have to make some choices about themselves and their children. So really help that decision making process with active listening, which we train advocates to do. What does that mean? It isn't just listening, without saying anything. It's ensuring that person knows you're listening, right? Offering things like smudging, if you're in a place where you can do that, having those available, sage, cedar, um, sweetgrass, and places where they can burn that and help them, and ask them if they feel like that would be helpful right now. Um, I've had victims even ask if I could pray for them, and I've done that. And and I'm comfortable doing that. Not all advocates may be comfortable doing that, but ask them. Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person for that, but uh, do you have someone, and do you need a ride over to see that person, or how can I help facilitate that? Okay. Um, Let her know that all feelings are normal to have, because this is a crazy time for this victim, right? What did I do to deserve this? Why is this happening? And so forth. There is no right or wrong way to experience this trauma. However, this victim is responding is that person's way of doing trauma. Okay. Next slide. legal, housing, economic, medical advocacy. These are more hats that this advocate wears, is to be familiar with the resources within all of these areas and to do their own research. I had a form, not a form, but kind of like a cheat sheet that was created by one of my colleagues, my sister, advocate, friend, sister. Her name is Eileen Hudan. And she had a list of, okay, these are some of the places that victims may need to visit. They may need to know who works here, and what kind of services do they provide. So she created this cheat sheet of, you visit this program, you get the names of the people who work there, and specifically what roles they have, what job function do they have, what are their hours, do they charge anything, and all of that goes on this cheat sheet. So you're doing your homework, your due diligence about these resources. Um, and also to work closely with these agencies on behalf of the needs of our relatives. So know the people there personally. So doing your own homework about forming those collaborative relationships with them to say, I'm from this advocacy program. This is the people that we work with, and they may be in need of your services. So let's work together and bridge this gap. Um, and providing that accurate information to our relatives that we're working with so they can make good decisions, have information available to give them, if that's safe to do. I hesitate often to give them a business card, because, their abuser may say, well, they may be back in contact with the abuser, and their abuser is like, I'm going to kill you if you go and tell anyone about what happened. To be careful about that as far as, giving information that this victim can take, that's maybe information in writing. So I just have that discussion with your office, with your staff, to see what's the safest alternative. We sometimes encourage victims to memorize, or put things in places that their abuser may not look. Right? Tape it to a drawer somewhere, or tape it somewhere where until you can memorize numbers. That's probably the best thing to do, is memorize numbers. But if short of that, safe places where you could put information that you could access quickly. Offering transportation, like I said earlier, feeding them, having coffee with them. And so always have that available if you're able to. Um, and setting up your own services based in the community, incorporating cultural traditions such as places where forensic exams can be done in the community by Native people, by Native women. Our aunties, such as women clinics where our relatives can obtain Plan B easily. There's been times where I know that people that I've worked with are not able to get Plan B, which is the emergency contraception. And then also just visiting with other women and utilizing herbal medicines. Should be medicine after that last word. Okay, next slide. This is just an example of spiritual healing. I'm not going to go over all these. These are some of the ceremonies. There's one that we did, our Indian Nations conference, which is the chair ceremony. This is just a picture from that, where we honor victim survivors of violence, and our relatives could come and, honor the spirit of their loved one who may have passed because of violence, and they can offer gifts to these chairs. And then at the end of the conference, we would give those gifts out. But there's ceremonies like wiping of tears that my partner and I used to do. There's the Lakota people have a ceremony called wiping off ceremony, where after a sweat, after a nipi, they wipe off this person. It's done, women to women, and with, of course, the absolute permission of the person they're wiping off. But it's wiping away all the shame, all the bad that this person is carrying, so that they could feel refreshed and renewed, with their physical being and their spirit. Um, so these are just some of the examples. A lot of our people are going to healing for like dances. Jingle dress dancing especially is considered a healing dress, and a lot of our survivors are going dancing in that dress. We're seeing a lot more of equine therapy. Our horse relatives being used in healing. And I again encourage to be careful about the people who run these. programs that they're safe, that they're knowledgeable, maybe offer to do some training with them, to work with them so that you're not setting someone up for more abuse or exploitation. Okay, next slide. This is the power and control wheel, again, to keep in mind the motives of abusers. And the reason I put this up is oftentimes, children are used to control the victim. If you report, you'll never see our children again. I'll report you as a bad mother, and you'll be charged. And I'll tell them that you sold drugs with me, and things like that that abusers, threaten their victims with. So it's important to keep this in mind that the primary motive, the hub, is the power and control. And these are all the different tactics that are used, and the outside are the actual acts of violence that can be prosecuted. Okay, next slide. Victim-centered advocacy is designed to re-empower victims. And I've been saying this throughout. We offer the options to victims because we want them to choose. So we offer them these options and make sure that we provide accurate information about what these services entail, where they're located, their hours, who's there, what are their names, what do they provide, do they charge, and so forth. And then at the victim's consent and choosing, we support them in whatever choices they make, right? They may not want any services. They may even return back to an abuser. We don't know that. But whatever choices they make, again, concern about safety should be mentioned always. I know that you're choosing to return to your abuser. I'm really concerned about your safety. Let's talk about that. Maintaining confidentiality is cornerstone of safety. So having clear confidentiality policies and procedures is so incredibly important. Empowerment, I've said that numerous times, in knowing the resources. Again, doing your own due diligence about your homework, about services that are available is again very important. Next slide. So a lot of differences in advocacy services in tribal communities versus elsewhere, and I've traveled across the country to everywhere. And, there's still a lot of tribes that are under-resourced as far as advocacy programs are concerned. And for the advocacy programs that do exist, they're so understaffed. Oh, it's heart-wrenching for me to see. They may be stuck in a little corner of an office, but yet they're serving a lot of victims, right? Between maybe two advocates, and the reservation is huge. Um, so to keep that in mind as well, the resources are different, often very limited versus maybe advocacy programs within an urban area, a non-native advocacy program. I worked at one, and there were four of us, which didn't seem like enough because we were serving about 1,000 victims a year, and that was both over the phone and in person. And those were on Duke cities, is a huge problem still today. I would say it's getting a little better, not a whole lot better, but it's getting a little better with ITWIG, and that's a whole nother topic that we'll address. And also additional responsibilities to educate non-native service providers. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Next slide. talk a little bit about service gaps and challenges. So I'm curious, what service gaps and challenges do advocates face when serving victims in your community? What are the gaps that still exist? And they could be anything, right? If you put them in chat, one said they're related to almost everyone. Seeing that. Service gaps. Resources and finances for them, mental health and classes. Distance. Distance between the advocacy program and the and victims, or distance. Someone said there's only a few of us who provide services. So once there's a conflict, many folks have no one. Oh, accessibility becomes an issue. Yes. Need a safe house. Immediate safe house and shelter not available. Oh, wow. Having the respondent serve court documents. Served. Oh, yes. That continues to be a problem. That's where the courts need to get and law enforcement need to really stay in contact with victims, because generally victims will know where this person hangs out, where they go socializing, friend's house, where they're gaming, whatever the case might be. So to stay in close contact with the victim, law enforcement need to do that. Long-term housing and therapy seem to be most requested. You know, we say, you go based on the victim's choices and what they need, what they want. Um, Oftentimes, victims can benefit from being able to just come and talk with other people who've experienced the same kind of violence, which can be very therapeutic without them having to go to an actual therapist, because a lot of experiences that are shared within a group can be helpful to a victim. I found them to be magical to have a support group. Um, and really, again, it goes down to facilitating the facilitator skills. And that's something we do training on as well here. A lot of emphasis here on these comments with mental health. That's concerning. Housing and emergency shelters that are culturally sensitive. Yes. And motion for public posting. Yes, absolutely. That will suffice as and be recognized as proper serving, proper service. Okay. Thank you so much for your input. Oh my gosh. Yes, still a lot of gaps and challenges. And I hope that more federal funding comes your way. And we will post opportunities as well on our website on and that I think someone posted that in chat. So thank you for that. Next slide. And some of you mentioned these transportation, or some tribal communities are huge. Housing seems to be an ongoing issue. And this is where often you need to develop a close relationship with your tribal leadership, because there could be, buildings that could be renovated to create a shelter, right? Or either that there could be safe houses that can be set up until a shelter can be established. And if you need more information about that, post it on our website or email me. Shelters, yes. Juvenile justice involved youth often have limited mental health and counseling service options. And then legal assistance. And this is the last one is the reason why this particular initiative exists is to create that collaboration between legal services and victim services. So hopefully we'll see more of that happening. Next slide. Benefits of collaboration. And I'll be talking more about the teams that are created often to address this in future webinars. And in the next one, I think I'll be doing more on that. But next slide. This is studies that were done on the benefits of advocacy services. If people don't, believe that advocacy services are beneficial to victims, these are good reports to read, and the citations are below the links. The statistics are old, but they're still very relevant. And these are specific examples in this study about how advocacy services have helped victims reducing feelings of guilt and shame, for example, increasing victims' confidence about participating in the criminal justice process. Okay, next slide. Some more information on the benefits of advocacy services. Okay, all right. I'm going to turn it over to my relative, my colleague, Marlon, who will take us through questions that you may have. You could post them or also take us through our resources and then also the evaluation. And yes, I want to hear from you all. Okay.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bonnie, for, as always, a content-rich presentation webinar. And again, for those folks who are still joining us live, this will be posted on our website that our colleague Suzanne has dropped. It's triballegalassistance.org. If you could kindly fill out the survey, which was just shared in the chat, we'd be very, very appreciative. And Bonnie had mentioned reaching out to her, and this slide has her contact email, which is bonnie@tlpi.org. So just quickly, this is a part of a three-part victim advocacy series, year 2. If you go to our website, you can see year 1, victim advocacy, and year 1, legal advocacy. And we bring this series to you from the Tribal Law Policy Institute as a training and technical assistance provider for the legal advocacy, legal assistance for victims, expanding legal services initiative grantees, and other legal services located on or near tribal communities. And we'll quickly go through some of again, here's our website, triballegalassistance.org. And here specifically is our page to request training and or technical assistance on our website. There is no wrong door. You can reach us through the TTA form submission or also from reaching out to our team. Our team email address is tlaps@tlpi.org. And here we have a resource, Tribal Legal Resource Code, Victim Rights, a condensed guide for drafting tribal victims' rights codes. It's available on our other website, www.home.tlpi.org. And here we have, on the same page, Pocket Guide, Tribal Victim Advocacy in Criminal Cases. In general, we have a plethora and a library of content that folks might be interested in. And you can access our publication page at home.tlpi.org/publication with an S. As always, you can please feel free to screenshot our team contact information. It's our first names @tlpi.org. And for those of us who still are joining us live in this recording, we have the webinar QR code, which means you can take out your phones, click on the link, fill that out, get that vital information, much appreciated information over to our team. And for those who would like to use a direct link, Suzanne has added that to the chat as well. And let's go ahead and do, as we close out today's session, review any of the comments, any of the questions. We don't have any Q&A submitted. Looks like our chat is a-okay. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to pause or stop the recording. And then we're going to go ahead and go and leave the screen up and take any questions that the folks may have. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in our other series